Hey guys, it's Selwen here, today talking about the Unholy Death Knight. Time to spread them AIDS in all your glorious fashion. Oh yeah. So Unholy in BFA hasn't changed too much. There is quite a lot of new things in your talents and a lot of your abilities received small tweaks. So in general, it still feels like a natural evolution to the Legion version, or more like a devolution on some aspects, as it's a trend in BFA. But, to be honest, there weren't many issues with Unholy. It was an amazing spec. Sure, you were a little bit shit at the start of Legion, with weird builds and highly dependent on Legos, and your numbers were absolute crap. But when Tomb came along, it became really goddamn good. The disease spreading, the bursting of wounds, your undead army of minions, all of that looked and felt super awesome, and in order to do that, the spec had its complexities, with a lot of buttons to click and a handful of things to manage at the same time, and reasonable amount of skill to be able to pull all of that correctly, but in turn highly rewarding of good gameplay. The big cons with it were usually related to lack of mobility, utility besides grips, the ramping up required for you to perform well, and again, a lot of management. Although you can see that as a positive thing. That said, without any further ado, let's talk main abilities. And on here, I'm happy to report that your artifact ability has stayed, and it is baseline. One of the few, so we are indeed quite special little snowflakes. Not only that, a few traits were baked into your abilities and talents, which is nice, but at the same time, not so much, right? Now, Apocalypse is slightly different, as now only costs 4 festering wounds, so only gonna summon 4 minions, but the reason for this is the overall change to the festering wounds mechanic. In Legion, it stacked up to 8, and you had the RNG component with your festering strike to generate between 2 to 4, but now festering wounds only stacks up to 6, and your festering strike either applies 2 or 3 wounds. So this change was an effort to kinda combat the RNG and the unpredictability of the wounds, and this way they feel, shall I say, more stable, as before could lead to weird moments where sometimes you simply wouldn't get the amount of wounds that you needed for, say, an Apocalypse. But now you always know that you either gonna get 2 or 3, and that your second hit you're gonna get to 4 to 6, so it's perfect to set up an Apocalypse on openers, and it's far more predictable in general, so all of your wound play feels more natural now. That said, Apocalypse no longer grants runes, which is kinda shit, and the minions last for 15 seconds. Then we get our Dark Transformation, which also got some tweaks. The first thing you will notice is that your Ghoul is back, our little Timmy, the Abomination talent is gone, and the Dark Transformation now only lasts for 15 seconds, as we no longer have the traits that increased it, but Death Coil here adds the cooldown reduction buff to Dark Transformation baseline, so the Dark Infusion talent in Legion. Only at 1 second per Death Coil, not 5 from the talent, but it also reduces the CD when the transformation isn't active. Once again, this is another great change to make Death Coil a more integral part of your rotation, and something that you want to maximize, which in turn will also maximize Dark Transformation uses, which feels quite powerful, especially in AoE, but again, this is beta, numbers might change. As for the pet abilities, have stayed the same. You get the stun, the charge that also interrupts, and the cleave when transformed, or just a normal claw attack. Death Coil itself, besides that buff, still is sort of the same, just costs less runic power now at 40 instead of 45, and it no longer grants energy to your pet, which you kinda noticed that's lost as well. Army of the Dead got its cooldown reduced from 10 minutes to 8 minutes, mostly because of a new talent that we're gonna talk more about in a bit. Death Grip, the same, you just have that glorious global cooldown attached to it, although it's not a true global cooldown, it's a shorter one that you barely noticed, so it's just there to break our fun of gripping stuff instantly while doing other stuff at the same time, which is quite annoying. And now on the second page, I can finally introduce to you the Decay Mobility, faster walking speed. But all memes aside, I do feel that our mobility is a bit better. Sure, Wraithwalk is now a talent, but if you choose it, you gain 2 mobility abilities. That isn't bad at all, plus Death's Advance passively prevents you to go below 70% of normal speed, and you can use it to gain 30% movement speed, and you cannot be slowed to 100% of your normal speed from that 70%, and you're gonna be immune to movement effects and knockbacks. So on that specifically, it's really cool when there's nasty knockback mechanics, and you're just gonna stand there like a badass while everyone else has to run like plebs. And as for most of these things are actually the same, so what I don't mention is because of that, just to save us some time. Icebound Fortitude is also slightly more powerful at 30% damage reduction, and then on your passives stay the same with your Runic Corruption, although the chance of it was increased as they are tweaking our resources still, and the same follows for your proc and mastery, they are the same as in Legion. Now, with all of that said, all of these changes, or rather tweaks, haven't changed much of our core gameplay. It's still all about spreading aids and bursting those nasty wounds in combination with your undead minions. On some things it does feel lesser, like the new Apocalypse or the loss of some other traits. So the little things like that, it does feel lesser, but your wound play feels more stable and more reliable. And as for general gameplay, you're still gonna be engaged as ever with your resource play, procs and management. Now moving on to your talents, and there are a little bit weird choices here, and one thing that you will notice, or that you noticed before, is that Summon Gargoyle cooldown is gone. And yep, that is true, as it was merged with your Dark Arbiter, which is fair enough, as Gargoyle on itself was a not so interesting cooldown, and you still get a glyph to change it to a Valkyr, or you can go to Ebola Hold to change it. I'm not sure how you can do that still in the beta. And as for the new iteration of the ability, we'll go over that later. So on the first tier, we now get Clawing Shadows, which you know all about from Legion. It makes your Scourge strike all based on shadow damage, so deals more damage due to your mastery, and also adds that 30-yard range, which is pretty cool and useful. If it's gonna be good or not, only time will tell when we get to numbers on live. All will follow on the same idea. You just get an extra pet, which now seems to go on melee range. I think it was range in Legion, like he had a little bow, but it's a pretty boring choice and quite lackluster considering the other talents, but it is a talent that might be replaced in the future, stated by the Blues. So keep a lookout in the comments if when that happens, or if it does happen in the beta, I'll make sure to update you there. Now, Infected Claws went down a few tiers and is now here. Your Ghoul's Claw attack has a 30% chance to cause a festering wound on a target. This right now is feeling pretty good and has a pretty good synergy with later talents, but in AoE is where this is gonna shine, as you well know, as popping a Death and Decay makes your Scourge strike hit all nearby targets, so if they have wounds up, you're gonna burst all of them, and since your Dark Transformation pet main attack also attacks in Cleave, meaning there will be a 30% chance for your pet to be spreading the wounds, for then you to burst in all that glorious fashion. So out of these three, Infected Claws is what's feeling the best right now in terms of synergy with the other talents, but Clawing Shadows is still there for a single target, depending on the numbers again. Not only that, in the second tier we get Bursting Swords back. It was nerfed a bit, Festering Wounds get their damage increased by 25%, down from 50%, but still gonna AoE all around the target. So when you mix Infected Claws idea here, in cleave/AoE scenarios can lead to really amazing results, or just to naturally cleave with every wound burst, so working perfectly with Infected Claws. Now, like in Legion, Ebon Fever is here to contest it. It makes your Virulent Plague deal more damage in half the duration, which is still a great choice. Again, no way of knowing if it's going to work the best without working out the numbers on live when they are tuned, but it is what it is, you know all about it. And this is kind of a trend in Unholy talents, by the way, contrary to some specs where you can immediately see where things go. Here is more like, yeah, this is good, and this other talent kinda does the same thing, and I can see it's good, but what about the numbers though? You know, like you really need to put some math to work out these talents, which kinda weird. Some specs that I've tested do not work this way. But hey, Unholy Blight makes a return, costs 1 rune on a 45-second cooldown, and surrounds yourself with a vile swarm of insects for 6 seconds, stinging all nearby enemies and infecting them with an unholy disease that deals pretty high damage over 14 seconds. So it's basically another dot, bursty kind of one on cooldown that you will gonna use when you see fit. Now, I have played with it and the damage is fine and works pretty well when there's a big pool. You can see your numbers going quite high, but gameplay wise it's just something that you're just gonna fire and forget. What's there to it is choosing the best moment to use it, plus there's a cooldown to take in mind, and it costs 1 rune. In dungeon scenarios, you probably want to be constantly AoEing, so Bursting Swords is gonna provide that, while Unholy Blight won't be available for every single trash pack. So again, it works and the numbers are fine, but I just see ourselves going for Bursting Swords instead, unless the numbers on Unholy Blights are absolute crazy on live. For single targets, again, there's really no way of knowing right now without working out the numbers, but I'm not really seeing us take Unholy Blight in single target. Next, you have your utilities, Asphyxiate, as in your Darth Vader stun, which is really cool. Death's Reach for better grip, increasing the range by 10 yards, and killing an enemy that yields experience or honor resets the cooldown. Pretty good also, but for control. And then Grip of the Dead, Death and Decay reduces the movement speed of enemies within its area by 90%, which is a lot, but then decays by 10% for every second. So you get a slow, better mob control, or a stun to choose from. Next, you have your talents that will help with your runes, so basically resources, like Pestilent Pustules. Bursting a wound has a 10% chance to grant you runic corruption. So again, working best with Infected Claws back here and Bursting Swords, just because they also improve your wound play, just to help out on those runes for you to get more runic corruptions. So works pretty goddamn well. Now, it has changed from Legion. In Legion, it just grants you a rune every set amount of wounds. So here is more RNG than in Legion, and I'm sensing this will work best for AoE, so when you do your Death and Decay wounds explosion thing, there will be a very high chance for this to proc. Harbinger of Doom was one of your traits and in turn makes your sudden doom, so your Death Coil procs a passive, trigger 15% more often, and you can accumulate up to 2 charges. So again, it's going to improve your runic corruption, this time to do more Death Coils. This talent really only going to work if you go to a build that isn't so focused on wounds, so things like Long Shadows with Ebon Fever or something, and then obviously with Summon Gargoyle for obvious reasons. And of course it won't work all that well for AoE since more Death Coils won't do much there. Soul Reaper is now here also and has changed a lot. It's on a 45-second cooldown, applies a dot that deals damage over 8 seconds, and if the target dies with it active, you gain 10% haste for 8 seconds, plus generates 2 runes. And honestly, I don't really see where this could fit. Dungeons would be the obvious choice for you to get that haste buff, so it actually procs when you kill mobs. I mean, in raid bosses that won't work at all, so maybe you can take it for runes, sort of like Apocalypse worked in Legion. But the 2 last tier talent choices really needs you to get Harbinger of Doom, like Summon a Gargoyle, an Army of the Damned, and then Holy Frenzy really benefits from Pestilent Pustules. So Dungeons is the only place where this could make sense, or open world stuff, but then there's the cooldown of 45 seconds. So it's the sort of execute that is a dot on a cooldown, Kinda weird, isn't it? If the cooldown resets when it procs that haste buff, then I could see it work well in dungeons. As it stands, is a bit weird. Just to get to runes, might as well just go for the other choices and just go for RNG on those runic corruptions. Then you get survivability or mobility choices. You get your Wraith Walk back, which I know it sucks, but remember, you get a death advance, plus this Wraith Walk lasts for 4 seconds, but on a 1-minute cooldown. You also get a Spell Eater for a stronger anti-magic shell, and Death Pack as a big cooldown heal. After you get your AoE choices, you get Defile back, although a bit different, replaces your Death and Decay like before to deal more damage, and grows in size every second. Now, it no longer gives Mastery, but is on a reduced cooldown of 20 seconds. Now it's just gonna take Defile for more damage and more frequent Death and Decays. Pestilence is just improving Death and Decay itself, having a 10% chance to apply festering wounds to the enemy, so again working great with the other choices which also improve or boost your wounds. That said, Epidemic just feels too good to not take now, as Epidemic now costs 30 runic power, not runes, meaning it's gonna fix the issue that Unholy had in AoE, where you either had to overcap runic power or you just had to use death coils for corruptions and to dump your runic power, which felt a bit annoying and clunky. Now, Epidemic is here to fix that. It's spammable, deals pretty high damage as it damages your infected targets and AoEs around them, and obviously can still proc your runic corruption. Now, it doesn't work with your death coil proc, sadly, so you're still gonna have to use them, nor does it benefit the cooldown reduction thing on Dark Transformation. I would like it to at least make it work with the cooldown reduction, but I can see that becoming even more powerful than it is, because right now running with Epidemic feels a bit like a must, at least for dungeons. It's just something that I'm really not willing to give up, even though Pestilence is quite nice also. So now in AoE, in between all of your wound bursting with bursting swords and death and decay and scourge strikes, you're gonna be weaving in your Epidemic for even more nasty effects and even for more damage, and to actually use your runic power. And then on last year you get Army of the Damned, just a passive where your Death Coil and Epidemic, if you talented it, will reduce the cooldown of Apocalypse by 1 second and Army of the Dead by 5 seconds. So what this will end up doing is more minions for you to summon over the course of a fight, and they are rather powerful right now, but keep in mind this is beta, numbers might change. That said, Army of the Dead should be able to be usable twice a fight or so, depending on the duration, much like the tier set from Antoros, while Apocalypse should have its cooldown reduced by about 20 seconds or so, something like that. Now, it's a passive, so there's not much to it, but there are talents that will obviously aid it, like the Harbinger of Doom for more death coils, and then it will further benefit from proper use of death coil and management of runic power and your resources in general. How good this will be, again, we'll have to see when we get live, but this one only seems to be useful for raids, not much for dungeons. And now, Unholy Frenzy is a new cooldown. It's just on a 1.3 cooldown, which is a bit weird of a timer, but hey, and it's essentially a mini Bloodlust, giving you 20% haste, so it's gonna overall reduce global cooldowns and increase your rune regeneration and whatnot, plus each auto attack will apply a festering wound, so it's a mix of the old Unholy Frenzy, sort of, and the Blighted rune weapon talents, and where this will work best is with talent choices that heavily focused around wound bursting, like bursting swords, pestilent pustules, and etc., where you can go on this spammy type of mode when you pop it, where you're just gonna be bursting and building a lot of wounds, and the haste will allow to keep those runes up, and then the auto attacks for more wounds, and etc, and etc. Again, like Army of the Damned isn't something super interesting, but I particularly like it, as it kinda changes the way you play a bit, going into a more spammy mode and faster mode is not something that you usually see in Unholy unless you are Bloodlusted, even though you can argue getting a big haste buff isn't very Unholy-like. but that's what we get. As for AoE, it can work somewhat with wounds build, obviously, so if you combine with all of your CDs again, in that death and decay galore, you're gonna be bursting even more wounds, so works rather well. And then lastly is your Summon Gargoyle, which, like I said, is basically your Dark Arbiter, but has been slightly tweaked, as now the cooldown is 3 minutes instead of 2, the duration is 30 seconds instead of 20, and the power increase is now 1% attack power to 2 runic power instead of 1-to-1 ratio. Basically, it just feels much weaker now than the Legion version, because 1, you're not gonna have it as often, and 2, even though it stays for 10 seconds longer, it's harder to stack up the damage increase. Not only that, you no longer have Unholy Frenzy for the attack speed increase for more procs on the death coils, nor you can take Pestilent Pustules as you really need Harbinger of Doom. Gameplay-wise, it still is that sort of ability that you need to set up, like pooling runic power and procs, but these other changes on the talents and on the ability itself can make it weaker and feel a little bit clunkier than in Legion. So does that mean the death of Arbiter? Well, again, we can only know for sure when we get to live and see the numbers. Overall though, Unholy, it's feeling pretty good right now. I quite enjoyed myself, as I enjoyed it in Legion, although there are some weird things here. But the big question is it better than in Legion? Well, in a world that we live in called BFA, I would say that we are safe comparing to most other specs. As long as our numbers get tuned appropriately, we are safe, and it still feels fun to play, but I wouldn't say it's better. In dungeons or AoE is where I got the most fun out of it, simply because your AoE is so much fun, especially with the new epidemic. The bursting of wounds is still so satisfying, and you can even set up these mini moments of glory, which is really cool. The aesthetics of Unholy, like in Legion, really do fit with the theme and overall gameplay. If you see a lot of shit and pus around you, you know, all those nasty effects, you know that you are popping on those meters as well, and I love that sort of visual response to your DPS. That said, that isn't something new to BFA, besides the new epidemic. As for single target, I personally like the Unholy Frenzy choice or build. There's not much to it, you're just gonna be spamming a lot of Scourge strikes, and it's not as in-depth as, say, the Arbiter or rather the new Summon Gargoyle, but I like fast playstyles, and Unholy isn't all that fast to begin with, but with Unholy Frenzy, you do get these fast moments, which kinda changes up your pace and you can go very spammy. So on that, I do enjoy, even though I know it's not a very awe-inspiring CD. Army of the Damned, you know, it's alright, it's just a passive that allows for more minions, which can be fun on that alone, because our army and minions in general are really cool to see, and just seeing them fight and stuff. So I won't mind using it if it's best in numbers or whatever. As for the new Arbiter, I mean, you know, if you like it, it still works in the same way gameplay-wise. It does feel a little bit less present with a cooldown increase, and overall feels weaker and slightly lackluster with the removal of traits and the changes on talents, but like I said, on live we can know for sure. In terms of survivability and stuff, it's pretty much the same as in Legion. Mobility things again, slightly better with Death Advance, and you have your Wraithwalk as a talent. You can see that as a bad thing or good. In terms of utility, you do bring some with your pet, with the stun and stuff, and obviously you have your grips. And then you also have a couple of slows and a single target stun if you spec into them. Not the best in general in terms of utility, but the grip kind of makes up for it, at least in dungeons. And of course you still have your combat res, which is basically your only utility in raids for most fights anyway. So guys, do let me know what you all think of BFA's Unholy. Make sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon to get more beta videos. And check out my Patreon if you wish to support the channel. As always, thank you for watching, have a fantastic day everyone, and I'll see you all next time. See ya!